We're going to be in Genesis chapter 12 today. Genesis chapter 12, and Lord willing, we'll go through chapter 25. Yeah, we'll see. All right, so Genesis chapter 12, as we continue our Old Testament survey. Let's just remind ourselves of the context. I think this is always important. I was just reminded by some of the teaching experiences that I've had in the past. I taught at Calvary University for a while. I taught at Blue Ridge Christian School, and so I've taught a lot of different age ranges. And it was amazing to me, especially in both of those Christian environments, how many people that I taught that didn't have kind of a biblical context to understand when Noah comes in relation to Abraham, for example, in relation to David. And I think sometimes we even forget that ourselves as we're teaching our kids, or we're doing, I think that context is so important because all of these things connect to each other and God is telling a story. And that's one of the reasons we're doing this Old Testament survey, is really to get that context. So I want to just contextualize that again today and remind us of some of the sections that we've been through before. We started with creation as one category, and then we went to the fall. Right after that, Adam and Eve sin. This is a very big deal. We're going to come back to this directly today because something very important that comes out of that is Genesis 3:15. In the result of the fall and all of this tragedy that's happening, and we saw how things get more and more sinful as we go. We have the flood immediately following as humanity gets really sinful. But right here we have the beginnings of the gospel. So we'll come back to that verse actually today because it's very much connected to where we're going in the life of Abraham. So after the fall, we get to the flood. Very much connected. This is not a cutesy story about a man with a bunch of animals on a boat. This is about God's judgment against sinful humanity, that we were so sinful as a result of the fall that it says in Genesis 6, that every inclination of man's heart always was towards evil all the time. All of that repetition in there, just emphasizing how sinful things are. And so God's response is, it must be wiped out completely. Doesn't that seem extreme? Yeah, but that's how bad sin is. That's what we deserved. And as a result of this, we still saw the same thing we saw here, that despite the judgment that happened, there was still redemption of Noah and his family. And we almost thought, well, hold on a minute, this seed that is promised here that is going to crush the serpent's head, maybe Noah is that person. That's what his father kind of thought. Lamech said he named him Noah because he thought we're going to have rest from the curse that God has given us. That's what he said. However, Noah was also sinful and his children were sinful. And God still said, while Noah was even offering a sacrifice to the Lord, that man was still bent on sin. We still have a sin problem despite the flood. So now we move into a new era, post-flood. We have the spread of the nations. God had to spread the nations because they had rebelled against him again at the Tower of Babel. And we move into a time that scholars generally call the time of the patriarchs. And really it's an emphasis on Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's why we call it that. So this is where we are now. And so we call it that because we're focusing on these three founding fathers of the nation of Israel. But really, I want us to, yes, we're talking about Abraham today, the life of Abraham, but really, let's remember this is God's story. And we're going to focus on what God is doing through Abraham. And I think we're going to see some amazing stuff. So this is the period that we are in. And just as an aside, this is probably also sometime during this time is when Job is happening. And so after we finish up Genesis, we'll probably jump right into Job. We don't know exactly when it's happening, but there's a neat connection between Job and Abraham and Melchizedek, which we'll talk about as well today. So I want you to keep that in mind, which connects again to what is it that God is doing. All right, so let's start with Genesis chapter 12, and this section right at the very beginning of that, because we're going to see some promises that God makes here, and then I want you to watch to see how many of these are fulfilled here, and then how many get fulfilled throughout the rest of the scriptures. This is so important. So let's take some time and read this one. So Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you." I love that. So, taking a look at that, he's promising this one man right now who's living under his father's authority. He's living in his father's household. And so generally, during this time period, the period of the patriarchs, we had a couple of different ways that cultures began to emerge. One was around these city-states, which we're going to see in Genesis chapter 14, which are kind of what they sound like. You have a king or some kind of ruler that is ruling over a city, and that essentially acts like a nation. And sometimes you have greater kings that are in charge of several city-states. And so we're going to see an example of that again in Genesis chapter 14. But then we have a number of people that live kind of a nomadic lifestyle, either because they have they're herdsmen, and so they're doing that, or they're just nomadic in general, following where food sources is, or seasons based on what area is fertile, or just generally a lot of cultures back then that have maybe they've settled down, but they still follow this kind of clan family type of structure where the oldest male is the head of the household. And so you might have, old grandpa there, and he's the head of the household, even though his sons are, ready there, they could take charge, but everybody follows dad. And that's kind of the structure. So it is very remarkable here that Abraham's being asked to leave his household, leave his father. It's kind of a unique thing. He's going to go out and follow God.
Do we know if Abraham is a firstborn?
Good question. Do we know if Abraham is the firstborn? I don't off the top of my head, but we can go back and double check. Go back to verse 27 of chapter 11. These are the family records of Terah. Terah fathered Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran fathered Lot. Sometimes the firstborn is mentioned first, but sometimes also the most important is mentioned first. So I'm not sure.
He's not. The firstborn was Terah.
Well, it said Terah fathered Abram.
Terah's the father to Abraham.
Okay, it says, no, Abraham was not the firstborn son of his father Terah, despite being listed first in Genesis. I guess it doesn't tell me.
Verse 31, Terah took his son Abram and grandson Lot.
Yep.
So, yeah.
Yeah. But it is interesting. I do like looking at who is firstborn and who is not. That is important for like Esau and Jacob as an example. There's a lot of really interesting firstborn things in the scriptures, especially in as it concerns Jesus. And, so it's a good question.
I was just thinking if he's firstborn and he's leaving, that is
And it seems like,
really significant.
Yep. He would be then taking over the family if that's the case. Yeah.
Exactly.
it seems like the firstborn really doesn't get anything from God. It always seems to go the second.
Yeah.
Like,
Or third or fourth.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, like Joseph and Cain and Abel, and it just Esau and
Yep. Yeah. Fantastic question. So he's leaving this. Yeah.
Well, I've read on a little further. It explains that this is God's typical pattern of choosing a younger son versus the older son, such as David was the younger of the brothers.
Absolutely.
It says
Yep.
Abram had two older brothers, Haran and Nahor. I figured Haran must have died because he took, isn't Lot his nephew? I mean his son?
Yes, Lot is his son, and then Abram seems to be kind of his protector. So, yeah, it definitely seems like Haran has died. Yep. Yeah, it's an interesting one. So Abram basically now is branching off, and he is kind of the clan leader now, as he is nomadic. But look at all of the things that this is saying. So as he's leaving his family's land in this area, he's going to make him a great nation, bless him, and make his name great. I want you to remember those things right now, or write those down. And then what you might do is list some examples of how that is immediately fulfilled in the next several chapters. Now, it's not only, I don't want us to say this is only ever fulfilled here in Genesis, because typically what happens, not every prophecy that God makes, but typically what we see in prophecies is something that we call a telescopic pattern, where there's an immediate fulfillment of the prophecy, but then it almost telescopes out, and then you see a couple of later fulfillments. So for example, where we have the prophecy of Christ being born of a virgin, there was a virgin that was prophesied to have a son, and that was fulfilled immediately. But there seemed to be there was something greater there that wasn't fully fulfilled. And then of course Christ is the ultimate fulfillment of that. So what we're going to see here is the same thing, is that God makes a promise that he's going to make Abraham into a great nation. And some of that is going to be fulfilled in Genesis, but not all of it, because God also pulls him aside and says, hey, look at the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. It's like, well, we didn't see that. He is a great nation, but he's not that great. So there's something else that is coming. And we're going to see him, he has a great name, and we're going to see him being a blessing to other people, and those that curse him are going to be cursed, right? But there's more that's going to come later. So this is something that, the reason it's so important, it has its own section here, is that this is a foundational passage for the rest of the scriptures. And I'll just give you kind of a spoiler here. The ultimate fulfillment of this blessing is Jesus Christ himself. Paul makes that very clear. He says, when God is saying, through you, all nations on earth will be blessed, we don't see that fulfilled here. Several nations are, but not all nations. Ultimately, Christ is the one that blesses all nations. Very cool. Hi, by the way. All right. So keep these things in mind, this promise to Abraham in chapter 12, and let's see if some of these things come to fulfillment. Because remember, this is less about Abraham and more about what God is doing in Abraham. All right. So I said at the beginning that this is very much about, Abraham's life is very much about the salvation that was promised in Genesis 3:15. So let's talk about that and then start tracing that. This is going to be kind of our guide through Abraham's life. And again, this is a survey, so there's a lot of things that would be really great to dig into, but we'll probably have to hit at a surface level. In Genesis 3:15, we know that someday we're going to have this seed from Eve. And so we're following that, and this promised person that's to come is mentioned as a he, and he is going to crush Satan's head. But there's kind of a big question mark. It almost seems that right after that, when Eve has her first child, she says that her womb is open and she has a male child by the help of the Lord. And so it's almost like, ooh, is this the one? Well, no, because he kills his younger brother. So that's not it. And then she has another one. She has Seth. Wow, cool. And then we mentioned that Lamech names Noah, and it's like he's going to give us rest from the curse. Maybe this is going to be the one. No, it's not Noah. Okay, now here's this Abraham guy that Scripture has really slowed down. And now we have these 12, 13 chapters of this life of this man where we had been passing hundreds of years, just verse by verse, right? Here this person lived 700 years and he died, right? Now we slow way down and we get this life of this one man. And so we almost think, is this the seed from Eve? Well, yes, he's connected to Eve. Is it a he? Yes. How is he going to crush Satan's head? And so we have this question. And then it's interesting because God begins to say, well, he's going to be blessing all of the nations through him. In other words, through Abraham's seed. And so it's almost like, okay, well, this guy's significant, but he's probably not the one. But he's significant in where the one is coming from. Which is why then we look at those genealogies in the New Testament from Jesus' line, they go through Abraham, right? Very important. And Paul makes a big deal about this. So let's start taking a look at what we learn about the coming of Christ and salvation in him. All right, so we then get to a special time here where God makes a covenant with Abraham. So let's go to Genesis. Do we want to do this one now or later? We're going to skip a chapter and come back to it. I think this is in Genesis 15, yeah. So the problem here is God makes this promise to Abraham multiple times. And there's a couple of things in there that I think is a good moment for us to camp out and have an application. And then we'll take a look at the Abrahamic covenant, the very big official one that tells us a lot about salvation. But in your life, when you feel like God has told you something, or you feel like you read the promises of God, but it just takes a long time to come about, Abraham is the guy you want to be reading. Whether it's a loved one that is estranged from the faith and you've been praying for this person for years and years and it doesn't seem like there's any fruit there, or maybe it's that you're having a difficult season, or you feel like you're walking through a spiritual desert or a physical desert or whatever it is. Abraham was promised something and it took years for that to come about. But God comes to him and reminds him multiple times. And Abraham tries and fails multiple times to take it on his own strength, and that was not the right move. But let his life, as we look at it today, be an encouragement to you that God is working in your life and he does keep his promises. But let's look at this Abrahamic covenant. So we are skipping chapters 13 and 14. We'll come back to those. Very important stuff happening there. But let's look at the main part of the covenant here. Chapter 15, verse 1, after these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I am your shield, and your reward will be very great. And so then Abraham reminds him, he's like, well, how is this going to be the case since I don't have any heir right now, right? So I've left my family, and now my slave is going to inherit my household. So that doesn't really seem like your promise that you made to me a while back is going to come true. But the word of the Lord came to him, this is in verse 4, this one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, look at the sky and count the stars, and if you're able to count them. And he said to him, your offspring will be that numerous. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Here's one of our points of salvation. Belief is credited as righteousness. Abraham's story, we've got the entire gospel laid out for us, as you will see, in its full form. And what Paul does, imagine the work that Paul has to do in speaking to a Jewish audience who is following the law, and they believe that in the law they will have righteousness. Now, when we look at that, when we look at how the Lord gives the law to Moses and all of that, we'll understand that was not its intention. So they have a misreading of what God intended, but they believe, okay, I get righteousness by following the law. And Paul has to deal with that. And he's like, no, it's never been like that. Because let's look for a minute and say, okay, your father is Abraham. Let's look at Abraham's life. When God came to Abraham and gave him the covenant, what happened first? This is in Romans that Paul lays out this argument. What happens first is Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. That is by grace through faith. That was not Abraham's work. And who was it that chose Abraham? Was it Abraham going, hey, choose me, God? No, God reached out to him. God chose him, God started the work, Abraham believed. So God gave him his righteousness. Because remember, Abraham is under the curse of sin. But God covered him with righteousness, just like he covered Adam and Eve in skins. And so Paul says, then later you get the covenant of circumcision. That came after belief. So it wasn't Abraham, here, follow all of these things. If you follow all of these things, then you can get righteousness. That's by works, and that's not what we see. And so here's the basis of our salvation. Don't let anybody tell you that Jesus was tacked on, that all of the Christian stuff came later. Of course, it did chronologically, I suppose, but it's always been here from the beginning. That's why Paul says, from grace to grace, from grace first to last. This has always been the way that God has operated. So you could lead someone through the Romans road, basically through Genesis, if you wanted to. Let's take a little bit more in here. So let's go to verse 8. But he said, Lord, how do I know that I will possess it, this land that you're promising, this kid that you're promising, all of those kind of things? A fair question. He's still struggling. He believes, big B, but he still struggles the day-to-day belief like you and I do. Like, how will I know? Can you help me with my unbelief? Verse 9, he said to him, bring me a 3-year-old cow, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. So he brought all of these to him and cut them in half. This is an interesting one, right? Kids love this when we talk through this passage. Cutting up all these animals, laying the pieces opposite one another, but he did not cut the birds in half. Birds of prey came down on the carcasses, but Abraham drove them away. Sorry, I keep saying Abraham. He's Abram at this point. As the sun was setting, a deep sleep came over Abram, and suddenly a great terror and darkness descended on him. And the Lord said to Abram, know this for certain, your offspring will be resident aliens for 400 years in a land that does not belong to them, and will be enslaved and oppressed. However, I will judge the nation they serve, and afterwards they will go out with many possessions. By the way, you catch that? This promise that's coming over 400 years later, those who curse you, I will curse, right? Okay. But you will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at an old age. In the 4th generation they will return there, for the iniquity of the Amorites has not reached its full measure. When sun had set and it was dark, a smoking firepot and a flaming torch appeared and passed between the divided animals. On that day the Lord made a covenant with Abram, saying, I give this land to your offspring, from the brook of Egypt to the great river, to the Euphrates River, the land of the Kenites, Kezites, Kadamites, Hethites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Okay. So, these are all animal carcasses that have been cut in half. And here's this path down the middle. And here is person number 1 and person number 2 in the ancient world. Let's say we're entering into a land contract, and I'm going to use this land, you are selling me the land, and we are going to be bound by the terms of this contract. In this time period, what they would do is cut up animals like this, and the 2 of them would take turns passing between it, walking through the blood. Very pleasant. Basically, the idea is, if I break this covenant with you, may I be cut up just like these animals. And so they are both taking risks, they are both sharing this burden of the covenant. When God makes a covenant with Abram, who passes through? God. So here's Abram right here. He falls into a deep sleep. Here's God up here. God makes the covenant after Abram believed. He does not have Abram pass through that, because keeping God's covenant, man cannot do. So God, as Paul will later say, swore by himself. He went through, and he is going to keep the covenant, knowing that Abraham will try, but the flesh is willing, but it will fail. It's weak. Isn't that amazing? Let me pause for any questions or comments on this part.
The animals, they sounded like later recommendations for sacrificial animals.
Yes, there's very much a sacrificial tone here. These animals are sacrificed so that the covenant will be kept. and so that Abraham doesn't die. And also, notice how God is protecting Abram. So as God passes through, Abram doesn't see God and die, right? So very fascinating. But yeah, definitely there's sacrificial
So
elements
much
here.
of this leads to Christ here, the shedding of blood,
Yep.
Christ's shedding of blood. It's all so intertwined.
Yes. Yes, it is intertwined. I'm glad that you saw that.
Well, basically, when they sacrificed it, the blood was what washed them clean.
Uh-huh.
So, Christ's blood, what hides our sin from God.
That's right. Remember what he promised Adam and Eve on the day that you eat from this fruit. And let's just say, on the day that you rebel against me, that's really what's happening there. You will surely die. They didn't, but something else died for them. The flood. You rebelled against me so much, I'm going to kill everybody. Except I'm going to cover you guys in the ark. And then they started offering sacrifices. Well, we actually have Cain and Abel offering sacrifices. So the sacrificial system has been around for a while. It's just not the same as it is later, but there's a lot of similarities. This is why also Job. So there must have been some kind of system that God had instituted after Adam and Eve, because he does not accept Cain's sacrifice of veggies, because veggies don't have blood. Okay. Can you imagine cutting into a carrot and it's like spewing blood, right? Like that doesn't happen, right? Thank you.
Mental image.
And that's the reason why the writer of Hebrews says we can basically say that nothing, without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. Like everything was ratified by blood in this covenant. So that's why he accepted Abel's sacrifice. So God must have communicated in some way that he wanted a sacrifice, because we see Cain and Abel offering sacrifices, we see Noah offering a sacrifice, and Job is offering sacrifices for his family.
Well, wasn't
So-
blood thought of the life force?
It was, and that's why here, after post-flood, God says, "Don't eat the blood and the animals, and if you kill someone, I will require your blood." Right? Blood is sacred, and there's a reason for that. He is setting up. That's something we didn't really spend time on, but he's also setting up Jesus as ultimately giving his blood for us. Yeah.
Why did the animals have to be 3 years old?
It's a good question. I don't know the answer to that one. Why do the animals have to be 3 years old? I think part of it, because we do see this in the law, that there's a requirement, and it has to do with purity. Like the animal is probably young enough that it's considered to be pure, but I don't know for sure. That's a great question,
I
though.
can tell you heifers, they don't
Uh-huh.
breed until they're 3 years old.
Interesting.
So they would be losing a producer, so it
Okay.
becomes even more,
Sacrifice.
more sacrificial,
Yeah.
more meaningful as a sacrifice.
That's
more,
good. I
more,
like that.
more-
Well, and if you think of it, sacrificing a baby animal just sounds wrong because we have babies.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so,
It's interesting. We're going to come back to the covenant because we're still not done. God is kind of unveiling the covenant just like this telescope. He gave Abram a promise, and then we're moving to part 2 into this covenant with the animals being cut up. We're going to get to circumcision later. But let's head backwards now to a very interesting situation that happened before this. So again, apologies for the jumping around in terms of chronology, but I did want to visit the covenant here. But let's take a look at how God immediately starts fulfilling some of those promises with Abram. And this is chapter 14, which I always consider the Lord of the Rings of Genesis. It very much has this feeling of an epic fantasy type of situation. And I want us to get the scope of this, because I can't tell you how many times I read through Genesis, and number one, just kind of skimmed through this passage, and number two, when I did read it, really didn't think through everything that was being said, and it's really incredible. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 14. What we have here, to summarize the first several verses, is we have a series of kings that are essentially in that city-state situation that I mentioned before. So you have several kings that are underneath one big king. So we'll just call him an emperor for our purposes here. So we have all these little city-states with their little kings in charge of their lands, and then this big king that's ruler over all of them. And it just so happens that some of the kings get fed up with Mr. Emperor and say, we've had enough of you, we're going to rebel against you. And so we have this big civil war that's erupting in this whole area. The big problem, and why it's important for us, is Lot has moved into that area. He and Abram have separated because their herd sizes have been getting very big, which is also a partial fulfillment of what God had promised. So they're getting pretty large. So Lot has moved into the area of Sodom and Gomorrah. And those, by the way, Sodom and Gomorrah, those are two separate city-states that kind of work together. And they are part of this group that is rebelling against this king. So there's this huge battle that's here. Okay, verse 4, they were subject to Chedorlaomer, who's that emperor guy, for 12 years, but in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him came and defeated the Rephaim in Ashtaroth, Karnaim, and Zuzim and Ham, and Emin and Shavath, Kiriath. I'm just making this up, the names. We don't know.
Works for us.
Yep. So what we have here, this is the battle plans, and we could map this out. I'm not going to map it out right now, but basically it's very similar to a lot of other wars that have happened in this area. People are coming down and they're fighting in this area. It's a very, very key traffic area as well, which is why he wants it. They call it the Highway of the Kings, the area where Israel is, because you have sea on one side and you have desert on the other, and you've got this nice strip of land that has some fertile areas and is perfect for moving armies through. So that's what they're fighting over. And they defeated a lot of people, right? So we'll skip through here. Verse 8. Then the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and lined up for battle in the Siddim Valley against King Chedorlaomer of Elam, King Tidal of Goim, King Amraphel of Shinar. Shinar, by the way, is the area of Babylon. That's interesting, isn't it? And King Arioch of Elasar, 4 kings against 5. So play your dramatic Lord of the Rings music here, right? We've got some big armies that are facing off of each other. And check this area out where they're fighting. The Siddim Valley contained many asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, and some fell into them, but the rest fled into the mountains. And so this is kind of this setup. Verse 12, they also took Abram's nephew Lot and his possessions, for he was living in Sodom, and they went on. So this army comes through. They plunder the area, they take captives, very common for this time period, and they go away, and Lot has been kidnapped. So let's look at Abram's response here. This will give you an idea of just how big, if you've never thought of this before, just how big Abram's family actually is. One of the survivors came and told Abram the Hebrew, and by the way, I believe that's the first time we have the name Hebrew, comes from his ancestor Eber, but he's also living in Hebron, which was probably named after his family, so he's kind of being called this, who lived near the oaks belonging to Mamre the Amorite, and brother Eshol and the brother Aner, and they were bound by treaty with Abram. Interesting, right? These people had a treaty with Abram, this little, we just think of as this dude with a couple attempts. Wrong. That is not what he was like. When Abram heard that his relative had been taken prisoner, look at this. He assembled his 318 trained men born in his household. Okay? Think about the logistics of this for a minute. If you have 318 men who were born in your household, that means you've been wealthy enough for a while to support families who can have 318 babies. But that's not it, because those 318 babies, those are the trained men for fighting. Why does he need 300 trained men for fighting? Because to support that many families that he must have, and all of their cattle and livestock and all of that stuff. Remember when Lot and Abram split? Was so massive, they need to protect against raiders. So his trained fighting force does not include all of the logistics force that would need to be there as well to provide, right? The shepherds that he must have, the people making meals, all of these kind of things. So we need to picture Abram as the leader, almost a king of a city-state that is mobile. Probably hundreds and hundreds of tents. Okay? And he's getting mixed up in a civil war because it's personal for him. His nephew has been captured, right? So he leads a campaign. This is about a 140-mile campaign that he takes with these men. Okay, so let's see here, verse 15. He and his servants deployed against them. That's a military term, right? They deploy their little army by night and defeat this. So this army that just defeated 4 other kings and plundered their cities, Abram goes and defeats them with 318 men. Now, I'm not saying, okay, this is, Abram's a tactical genius and, this is God, clearly, who's doing this. But still, this is a pretty sizable force that he has, and he's fighting against kings in this empire-building scenario here. He brought back all the goods that they had just plundered, and his relative Lot, and his goods, as well as the women and other people. So in other words, everything they just took, he took back with a smaller force. Wow. So then he comes back, he's getting ready to give that stuff back to all of the people that it was stolen from, but then he has this really fascinating encounter at Salem, which eventually will turn into Jerusalem. Okay, after verse 17, after Abram returned from defeating Chedorlaomer and the king, so he's Luke Skywalker, he's defeated the emperor. Okay, the king of Sodom went to meet him in the Shava Valley, that is the King's Valley, and Melchizedek, king of Salem. So here's this other city-state guy who wasn't involved in the fighting, but who is there in Salem. By the way, Melchizedek means king of righteousness. He brought out bread and wine, and he was a priest to the God Most High. That there's no mistake. Don't think, oh, this is some other God. This is God's priest. He is a high priest to our God. Wow. Okay, what is that? And he blessed Abram and said, Abram is blessed by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has handed over your enemies to you. So here's this guy acknowledging what a great victory God has done through you, Abram. And Abram gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth. He gave him a tithe. You only give a tithe to someone who is more worthy than you. And the writer of Hebrews makes a big deal about this. We have studied this when we looked at Hebrews. He basically says Melchizedek essentially is a type or a picture of Jesus. He's the king of righteousness, and since he's the king of Salem, which means peace, he's also the king of peace. That's cool just in and of itself. He's a high priest, and he's the only high priest who's also a king. Pretty cool. There's many other things the writer of Hebrews does here. Some scholars, and maybe you think this too, some scholars think this was actually Jesus Christ in the flesh, like pre-incarnate. But it kind of makes sense, and probably the majority of scholars would say Abram's not the only guy that knows the one true God. And that should bring us a lot of hope in telling kind of the global story of our salvation. God has Abram as his prophet, and he is a prophet. God has Melchizedek as his high priest. And then remember Job? God has Job. same time period, right? Maybe that's same. So you have God operating through Job and doing things. He's telling his story there. He's got Melchizedek over here. He's got Abram over here. I think that kind of gives us a neat perspective of how God is working during this time period, and gives us some hope after the flood. Okay, let's pause here because I know this whole section, there's a lot here. Melchizedek's fascinating. There's this whole tenth tithe that he's giving. So anything that you want to point out here, any questions that you have?
Well, was Melchizedek a leader of a church or
Good question.
king, or
Yeah, so the
how
question
did he
is,
get to be a
who
priest?
is Melchizedek? Like, is he a leader of a church? Not a church. Churches don't exist yet. Paul talks about churches as a mystery. That was not something that was revealed until Jesus said to Peter, and I will build my church. was the first time that was used in that regard. So no, but he does seem to have a, I don't want to call it a temple, but a place where he was able to be a priest, probably an altar. And so he is considered to be the high priest of God Most High, and he's there in Salem, the future site of Jerusalem. We don't know much detail. There's a lot of mystery around Melchizedek, which he's so interesting, but the answer is mostly, I don't know. He is a king of a city-state, and he's high priest of God Most High. Why? I don't know.
I think Abraham knew him before he ran into him in this scenario.
It kind of seems like that, because he gives them all of this stuff. It's really interesting. Yep. Anything else? Okay. So here we have a couple of things I just want to point out, if you hadn't caught this already, that when we were talking about that blessing, I will bless you, I will make your name great, I will make you a great nation. Look at how many people he has in his household, how much flocks need to support that, and the fact that he is acting as if, because of God, he is acting in a national system and taking part in a war and defeating kings. That is a fulfillment of that. We're probably not going to have time to look at his interactions in Egypt and his interactions with King Abimelech, but those are other examples if you want to dig into those. It's the two occasions where he has Sarai lie and say, well, I mean, technically it's not a lie because she is his sister, but on the other hand, it's a lie. Interesting situations, but those are both other situations where he's dealing directly with kings as if he's their equal. Very interesting.
My mother always said a half-truth is a lie.
Yep.
But
Yep.
we still use it as kids, but we always got in trouble.
That's right. Good stuff.
Thomas,
Yes.
I'm thinking here that for Abraham, this was quite a challenge to him in the fact that he didn't succumb to all this
Yeah.
wealth,
Yes.
power, prominence, whatever you want to call it. He could have just really kind of gone off the deep end the other way here.
That's right. Yeah, absolutely. Look at this, because look at his humility. Verse 21. The king of Sodom said to Abram, give me the people, in other words, those captives that were taken, but take the possessions for yourself. In other words, all this plunder that you rescued for us, you have all of that. But Abram said, verse 22, I have raised my hand in oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will not take a thread or sandal strap or anything that belongs to you, so you can never say, I made Abram rich. In other words, my blessing comes from God. And so he returns all of this stuff. He gives a tenth to the king of Salem, and he just goes with what he had. He got Lot
Easily
back.
ignored all that and let greed take over.
That's right. So he could have taken it into his own hands at that moment. His blessing, he could have tried to do it from the flesh, but he didn't. He gave it back to God. Were you going to say something?
So basically, Abraham saves Sodom and Gomorrah,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
he doesn't take any of their stuff, and he keeps that line
Uh-huh.
of, "Hey, this is not me. This is you."
Yep. Yep. So on that note of Sodom and Gomorrah, they're going to come back. We got to deal with the covenant of circumcision first. So yay, circumcision.
Oops.
So we have this covenant up here with the animals being cut up. We also have circumcision. All right, so why? Why circumcision? Come on, right? So circumcision is very interesting. Number one, to Paul's point, belief came before this covenant. Belief came before the covenant of circumcision. So when the Jews later rely on circumcision as like the sign that they are saved, so to speak, Paul's like, you need to be circumcised in your hearts. So circumcision really is supposed to be a picture of our belief. Why? How is that? Well, what circumcision is basically picturing for us is that we are set apart. While it was a practice that was practiced by a couple of different nations at the time, so it was not totally unique, God is using it in a very special form as a sign, and basically saying, cut off the foreskin, and if you refuse to do that, and we'll see this later when God gives the covenant to Moses, if you refuse to do that, may you be cut off from your people, just like this skin that you refuse to cut off. So it's very similar to this. May we both hold this covenant, otherwise may we be cut off just like these animals. Okay, so there's a similarity there. There's also a reference to blood there, yeah.
So, but with, what was it, 8 days, the baby
Yep.
boys were to be, so is the belief of the father, none of the child.
Yes,
So that,
Reflected onto the child, yeah.
yes.
yeah.
Yeah, so there's kind of the special family bond there and the belief of the father circumcising the son, but then later, then that arrogance of some of the people saying, okay, well, and this is why I believe. But do you believe? Are you circumcised? You're circumcised outwardly, but are you circumcised in your heart?
Oh, okay.
You see? So this sets you apart physically as one of God's people, but that was only supposed to be a symbol of this right here.
So basically, it's a symbol of the father's belief, and
What? Yeah,
and
of
then they'll
everyone's.
teach
Yep.
him to be
Mhm.
to believe.
Mm-hmm. Yep. So that's why the covenant of circumcision, again, God is continuing to unfold his plan and operate. Now, the other thing here is this is an indirect reference to this, right? Through the seed of the woman. He's basically saying, I want you to circumcise this instrument that allows you to have children. All right? Yay, we can talk about this. And then from that, this holy seed is eventually going to come. And so it's definitely related to that family line. Setting apart your kids as holy. Circumcise on the 8th day, all of those kind of things.
Which makes me wonder when the people sprinkle their kids that they're setting them aside to be holy.
Yeah, in a way, it's fascinating, right? Because we do have baby dedications where we're kind of doing something similar to that, or you have the sprinkling.
Right.
Baptism also is a symbol, right? Baptism, as Peter says, doesn't make you saved, but it is a symbol of what is happening to you spiritually. Yep, very true.
So were the women not considered righteous back then? Since this is all kind of based on men for the most part?
So the men are considered to be the federal head, and what that means is like Adam is our ancestor, and he directly sends from God, and then we descend from him, so he's kind of like our spiritual head, and each man then kind of represents the head of their household. It's not saying that, okay, men are the most important or anything like that. It's that it's kind of the family clan structure. The family takes its leadership from the head of the household, and they're not necessarily lesser, but they just look to that head as leader. And so the family is considered to be covered by that righteousness, that same righteousness. So it's not that women are unrighteous, it's that God was showing leadership through the male. Ultimately having its fulfillment in Jesus, who was cut off from his people, crucified outside the city, and he is male. And so it's kind of that line right there. But notice how Jesus treats women as well. And women, we're going to have to deal with this a lot in Leviticus, and that's going to be a very interesting study. So keep that question, we have to keep asking ourselves that question, because it's a difficult one to wrestle with.
At the same time, I think a woman could be unrighteous and her husband be righteous. I
Oh
mean,
yeah, absolutely.
It's not gonna take care of her for him to be righteous.
Yes, yeah. All right, so as we look at the last closing minutes of class here, a couple of other things we need to look at, and just kind of dipping through salvation here. We've talked about the covenant, great. Okay, we are now going to go to the offering of Isaac. So what we're skipping is this long time period where Abram is promised this son, and the son of the promise doesn't show up for a while. So Sarai says, hey, why don't you sleep with one of my handmaids and you can fulfill God's promise that way? So that goes back to this idea of when we try to fulfill the covenant ourselves in our own strength, that's a failure. And that should have been a symbol to the people of Israel. If you try to uphold this law yourself in your own righteousness, it doesn't work. Okay? So that's also a picture of righteousness. But now we have the sacrifice of Isaac. So we are going to talk about Isaac as a type of Christ. Type is kind of a confusing word. Foreshadow is probably the best English equivalent. Type is a little bit dated. It's related to the Greek word tupos, but foreshadow is probably the best terminology here. Isaac is a real person, has a real situation that he goes through, but it's a picture for us, or a foreshadow of Jesus himself. We've talked about this before. We looked at Isaac a number of times, but something that I really want to kind of highlight here in this is that he is, and I'm going to put my Isaac notes up here, he is the promised son. Not this promised son, but he is a promised son that is foreshadowing this promised son. Isn't that cool? So we still have to wait for this one, just like Abraham had to wait for this one. Well, we know this one has come now, but they were still waiting at this point in time for the promised son. He is also the only son. Legitimate. The only legitimate son, the true heir. Pretty cool.
Didn't God tell Abram to have a son?
Yeah. Yeah.
And he was trying to fulfill the prophecy, wasn't he?
That's right.
And so why is
So
this,
it's
why-
confusing.
Ishmael, why did that occur? Why did what's her name get pregnant in the first place?
Yeah. Well, that all happened because man tried to take the promise into his own hands, and that always results in more mess. And we see that repeated. But let's look at, why does God say, go sacrifice your own son? Verse 2 of chapter 22. So Genesis 22, verse 2, take your son, he said, your only son Isaac, whom you love, just adding that emphasis there. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains. God just promised this guy, and he said that through him all the nations of the earth will be blessed. So how can God be telling him to sacrifice his son and God fulfill his promises at the same time? So Abraham, even at this moment, he believes. How do we know that? Let's look down further. Verse 5, Abram said to his young men who were accompanying him, stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship, and then we will come back to you. One more point. Isaac says, the fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Abram answered, God himself will provide the lamb for the offering, my son. And then that's exactly what happened. The writer of Hebrews takes this and calls Abram the believer, and he says Abram knew that he could receive his son back from the dead. So either God was going to have him kill his son and he was going to come back from the dead, which, by the way, would not be new, because essentially he came back from the dead when God opened up Sarah's dead womb and the son was born. So, twice back from the dead, God can do that, right? But he specifically says he is going to provide for. So he's probably imagining something like what actually happened, which is fascinating. Okay? Why do I have 3 days on here? Minor point, but interesting that there's 3 days that they journey to the site, and Jesus is in the tomb for 3 days. That's just kind of fun. Isaac carries the wood. Jesus carried his cross. Check this out. Anybody know where Moriah is? Mount Moriah? It's the Temple Mount. This is the future site of the temple. I don't know if he then says hey to Melchizedek as they pass by. Where are you going? I'm going to go sacrifice my son. Be right back. You know, it's very interesting, right? He was there with Melchizedek. He goes back to the future temple site to sacrifice his son. Kind of interesting. God provides. He did not have to sacrifice Isaac. This was this beautiful picture of worship that they were doing. Abram wasn't just saying that, like that's not a lie when he says we're going up to worship. This was an act of worship that he was doing.
And Isaac knew he was alone, but he was never scared.
That's right.
When it's like, where's
Yeah,
sacrifice?
Isaac, we could probably continue listing things here. There are also several other really cool parallels. Isaac is probably in his 30s or almost 30s. I think he's 37 when his mother dies. So I don't remember exactly how this lines up to that, but so roughly the same age as Jesus. Very cool.
As a mom, I just thought that just, taking my son.
Yeah, that's hard.
Since God knows everything, he's not really testing Abraham. He would know what Abraham was gonna do.
Yeah.
So is it to strengthen Abraham and to follow him and not-
Strengthen his
not
faith.
after when you have another child somewhere else?
Yeah, it's helping him understand and strengthening his faith in God. It's giving us a picture of what's to come. It's also a beautiful picture of worship. Not that we should go do this with our children, but that God was leading Abraham to do, and that sacrificial idea. It's also the prelude to the sacrificial system and saying, hey, we are not going to be offering our children as sacrifices until Jesus, and I will offer him, and his blood will be perfect. I will always give you a substitute of an animal until that point. So,
When you say
fascinating.
legitimate, because God only recognized the marriage, he didn't recognize the children as legitimate if they weren't, because God only ordained man and woman.
Yeah.
Man and 10 women.
That's right. And which is also important for legal reasons that Isaac be the one that the sacrifice or the blessings pass down to, and Jesus has to legally be able to be our substitute. And we've talked before about how legally he's able to do that. Okay, and this is one of those, right? For blood, when with God's covenant with Noah, that blood, the life is in the blood, right? That points back to that. Okay. I think we have time for one other point here as we finish up. Okay. And this is what happens after that, and just kind of unfolding the rest of this. Now Abram is going out of the picture. We've had this brief 1 week, couple minutes together on his life, and if you haven't read it, go back and read it. There's a lot of really cool stuff in here, and I wish we could study it verse by verse, but we're doing an Old Testament survey, so it's okay. We're going fast,
When
but
does he
I
become Abraham? Has he become Abraham yet?
it's after that point. I think it's right after that. Abraham. Nope, it's
No,
actually
it's
before
back-
this.
It's before when
Yeah.
he's.
Is it
the
circumcision?
visitors. I was thinking it was with
It
the
might be the
visitors.
visitors, yeah, and the Sodom and Gomorrah before
No,
that.
it's Abraham already.
Just a side note.
17 verse 5, no
Thank
longer
you.
will you
Yeah.
be called Abram, your name will be Abraham, and that is, at the covenant of the circumcision.
Awesome, thank you.
What happened?
Side note?
I was just saying, did you notice on all the threes that they've used, it's a holy number,
Yes.
but there, as you go, you already saw 3, and
Yeah.
it's going on, 3, 7, and 40, I think are holy numbers.
Yeah.
You
Yeah,
may
3
wanna
is
say
interesting.
what she said. Go on.
3, so Joe was saying that 3 is like a holy number. We see a lot of patterns of 3, and that's absolutely true. I think it's interesting that God shows up with 3, so that it's God and 2 angels that shows up to Abram. We didn't read that section, but right before he goes and destroys Sodom and Gomorrah. So fascinating. Okay, so the last thing here is Abram's going out of the picture, but God is setting up the promised son here. We can very clearly see how he is providing for Isaac. He has first saved Isaac from death, and then Isaac needs a bride, right? Because he can't pass on this family line. In other words, this promise could be cut off right here if we don't deal with Isaac. So this isn't just a cute story about, marriage, which it is a neat story, right? It's Isaac and Rebekah is a fun story to tell, but it's not just about that. It's about Genesis 3:15. And so as the reader, we're going, okay, Abram wasn't this promised one. Isaac wasn't this promised one, but he's like the promised one. What's going to come next? Well, he doesn't have any children. Oh no! Right? So what's going to happen? So we're on the edge of our seat waiting for this next seed. And we are going to then kind of take Isaac and Jacob next week. But we're kind of setting all of that up. All right, so that's kind of all the major points I wanted to hit. We missed a lot of things, or kind of just skimmed through them. I think we do have maybe 2 or 3 minutes to hit any questions that you had on any of these other things that we skipped over. Yeah.
I just find it fascinating, for Sarah's sake here, that Abram comes home and says, I had a discussion with God. We're going to have a nation, okay?
Yeah, that's right.
You on board?
Mm-hmm.
I just want one baby.
They stopped at 2.
That's right. Sarah, go, let's look at the stars together. Here's how many
Sarah's
babies.
busy.
That's right.
And then she's almost 100, right? Oh.
Yep.
But I can't understand how someone, in the Bible, they're afraid to go into a town because she's only 20 years younger than he is. So why would anyone be looking at her?
Yeah. I think too that like this.
You think it's out of contact?
I think that they probably looked much better than we do as we age now, because they're still pretty close to the fall, and though their timelines are much shorter, right?
Yeah.
Versus 700 years, 900 years, they're living. I think Sarah lived 125 years, Abram 170, something like that. I don't remember. But I have to wonder, like, they probably still look pretty good. We always picture them. I remember like flannel graphs and stuff as a kid going, why were people looking at Sarah, like wanting her? Because, they always had her like this old woman, and I'm like, probably she looked beautiful, I don't know.
Well, we think about the
Yeah.
earth that's decaying, and it doesn't just decay all at once.
Yeah, that's right. That's
So-
right.
I never thought of that.
Well, and then Abram too, he remarries. We skipped over the section too, but he has another wife after her when he's like 140, something like that. So,
He ends up having a lot of kids.
and he has a lot of kids. Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, let's close. Let's pray. Lord, I thank you so much for your word. Thank you for your promises to Abram. We can just see through this your hand at work, and just how salvation comes through you and you only. And you don't ask us to do all these works and we have to just do it perfectly and wonder, is this going to be enough? Is this going to be enough? What if I did it this way? What if I work harder? And if I fail, I need to cover it up. If we fail, if we confess our sins, you are faithful and just to forgive us our sins. Why? Because of Christ. And I thank you for that. Thank you for his blood. Thank you that you are going to finish the work that you do in our lives because of you, not because of us or what we do. You finish that work. Thank you for Abram's example of belief, and that is enough. That credits us righteousness. That's a beautiful picture. Lord, I ask that you would make this word real for us this week. Help us with the various things that we are dealing with and have to accomplish this week, that we look at Abraham's example and follow you through the wilderness of life and trust you even when it's hard. We ask in your name. Amen.
Don't forget that next week after Sunday school, we're supposed to go down to the gym. We have